December 8th, 1941, high above the Philippine Sea, just after dawn. The sun is barely clear of the horizon when Japanese fighters sweep in from the east, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning sky. Engines hum smoothly. Formations are tight, confident, practiced. Below them, the ocean is calm, unaware that the balance of air power is about to tilt decisively. Inside the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Flight Petty Officer Saburo Nishida rests his gloved hand lightly on the control stick. The aircraft responds instantly, almost delicately, as if reading his thoughts. He barely needs to apply pressure. The Zero floats, turns, climbs effortlessly. This is how air combat is supposed to feel. For Nishida and the men flying beside him, there is no doubt about the outcome of today's mission. They have trained for this moment for years. They know their aircraft. They know its strengths. More importantly, they know what the enemy does not yet understand. The Zero is not just a fighter. It is freedom. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots dominate the air with an ease that shocks the world. Over China, over Southeast Asia, over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, the pattern repeats itself. Allied aircraft rise to meet them and fall, burning moments later. The Zero climbs faster. It turns tighter. It stays airborne longer. Against it, Allied pilots fly machines that feel heavy, stubborn, slow to respond. Wildcats, Buffaloes, P-40s, rugged, well-armed, but unable to match the Zero in a turning fight. Pilots who try are punished instantly. Nishida watches it happen again and again. An American fighter breaks toward him, attempting to turn inside his arc. Nishida pulls gently, feeling the Zero tighten its circle as if pulled by invisible hands. The enemy aircraft slips wide, helpless. A short burst of cannon fire. The fight is over. There is no drama, no prolonged struggle. This is routine. Japanese doctrine has been built around this moment. Their pilots are trained to dominate the air, not with brute force, but with finesse, precise maneuvering, perfect timing, and absolute confidence in their aircraft. The Zero is light, unburdened by heavy armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. Every unnecessary ounce has been stripped away in service of performance. And it shows. Japanese pilots speak of the Zero almost reverently. It can outclimb, outturn, and outendure anything it faces. It allows its pilots to dictate the fight, to decide when to engage, how to engage, and when to disengage. Allied pilots quickly learn a hard lesson. If you fight the Zero on its terms, you die. In ready rooms and briefing tents across the Pacific, survivors struggle to explain what they've faced. They describe an aircraft that seems to defy physics, one that hangs in the air, pivots effortlessly, and appears behind them no matter what maneuver they attempt. Rumors spread. Some believe the Zero is unbeatable. Others believe Japanese pilots possess superhuman skill. Most simply know one thing: something is terribly wrong. By early 1942, Japanese fighters control the skies wherever they appear. Allied air units are forced onto the defensive, flying missions only when absolutely necessary, often at low altitude or under heavy escort. Losses mount, confidence erodes. For Japanese pilots, this dominance feels permanent. Nishida believes it too. In after-action reports, he notes how easily enemy aircraft are defeated. In conversations with fellow pilots, there is quiet pride, tempered, disciplined, but unmistakable. They believe they have mastered the future of air combat. But hidden within the Zero's brilliance is a truth no one wants to acknowledge: a compromise. To achieve its astonishing performance, the Zero has sacrificed something fundamental, something invisible in victory, something that only becomes apparent when the enemy stops playing by the expected rules. At this stage of the war, no Allied pilot knows what that weakness is. But they are learning, slowly, painfully, one engagement at a time. And when they finally understand it, when they stop trying to outturn the Zero and start fighting it differently, the balance of air power will begin to shift. Not because the Zero suddenly becomes a bad aircraft, but because perfection, once exposed, has nowhere left to hide. At this stage of the war, no Allied pilot knows exactly what the Zero's weakness is, but they are beginning to sense it. February 1942. Over the waters north of Australia, Allied pilots now fly with a new kind of caution, not the caution of fear, but the caution of observation. They are still losing aircraft, still outturned, still outclimbed, but something has changed. Some pilots are surviving. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch sits in the cockpit of his F-4F Wildcat, eyes locked on the airspace ahead. He has already seen what happens when American pilots try to fight the Zero the same way they fight European aircraft. They don't come back. Thatch understands something many others don't yet. The Zero's dominance is not magic. It is specialization, and specialization always carries a cost. In repeated encounters, Allied pilots begin noticing patterns. Zeros turn beautifully, but only if they stay light. Zeros climb aggressively, but bleed speed quickly in dives. Zeros dominate close-range maneuvering, but hesitate when fights become fast and vertical. Most telling of all, Zeros do not like to be hit. Even light damage sends them out of the fight. Fuel leaks, control surfaces fail, engines falter. Aircraft that seemed untouchable seconds earlier suddenly vanish, trailing smoke. This is not chance. It is design. The Zero's extraordinary performance comes from ruthless weight savings. No armor plate protects the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks absorb hits. Structural margins are thin. Every ounce is devoted to maneuverability and range. Against pilots who insist on turning battles, this weakness is invisible. Against pilots who refuse to turn, it begins to matter. Thatch experiments. Instead of chasing Zeros into tight circles, he and his wingmen fly in pairs. When a Zero commits to one aircraft, the other turns into its path, forcing the Japanese pilot to choose, continue the attack and risk collision, or break away and lose position. It works. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to matter. The maneuver becomes known as the Thatch Weave, and for the first time, Allied pilots feel something they have not felt since the war began: control. Zeros are still dangerous, still lethal, but now they are being denied their greatest advantage, the ability to dictate the fight. Elsewhere in the Pacific, similar realizations emerge independently. Pilots discover that diving away at full power works better than turning. High-speed passes reduce the Zero's reaction time. Head-on attacks once avoided become viable because the Zero cannot absorb punishment. Every lesson is paid for in blood, but every lesson spreads. By mid-1942, Allied pilots are no longer trying to beat the Zero at its own game. They are rewriting the rules of engagement entirely. The Zero has not changed, but the way it is fought has, and once the enemy stops giving you what you need, most predictability, your advantages begin to evaporate. Japanese pilots notice the difference immediately. Encounters feel different now. Allied fighters no longer linger. They strike once and disengage. They dive instead of turn. They refuse to chase. The Zero still wins fights, but it no longer controls them. And that loss of control, subtle at first, is the beginning of the end. The Zero still wins fights, but it no longer controls them. By the summer of 1942, Japanese pilots sense the shift before they can fully explain it. Engagements that once unfolded predictably now feel disjointed. Allied fighters no longer circle obediently. They slash through, fire briefly, and vanish downward at speeds the Zero struggles to follow. The sky, once orderly, has become chaotic. For Japanese pilots, this is deeply unsettling. Their training has emphasized precision and elegance. Combat is meant to be deliberate, an exchange of maneuver, patience, and timing. But now the enemy refuses to cooperate. Allied pilots are not trying to outfly the Zero. They are trying to survive long enough to hit it. Over Guadalcanal, this new reality becomes impossible to ignore. Zeros climb to intercept incoming American aircraft, only to watch them dive away before a turning fight can begin. When Japanese pilots follow, their aircraft accelerates quickly but then begins to vibrate, controls stiffening as speed builds. The Zero was never designed for prolonged high-speed dives. Push it too hard and the aircraft becomes dangerous to fly. American pilots know this now. They use altitude as a weapon. They trade space for time. They accept missed shots if it means staying alive. Every engagement becomes a calculation of energy rather than maneuver. And energy favors the heavier aircraft. The Wildcat is no match for the Zero in a turn, but it can dive faster, absorb damage, and keep flying after being hit. American pilots begin to trust this. They stop fearing single hits. They press head-on passes. They aim not for perfection, but for contact. Even a brief burst is often enough. Japanese pilots are shocked by how quickly Zeros fall once struck. A few rounds ignite fuel tanks. A single hit shatters control cables. Aircraft that moments ago seemed invincible break apart in seconds. The Zero's weakness is no longer theoretical. It is visible. In debriefings, Japanese pilots begin mentioning damage with unease. Light hits, they say. Unexpected failures. Commanders listen, but there is little they can do. The Zero cannot be redesigned mid-war. Its strengths and weaknesses are already locked in metal. What has changed is not the aircraft. It is the enemy. By late 1942, Allied pilots fly with a new confidence, not because they expect to win every fight, but because they understand how not to lose. And in air combat, that distinction is everything. The Zero still dominates inexperienced opponents. Against pilots who panic or turn instinctively, it remains deadly, but against disciplined formations and energy-based tactics, its margin shrinks rapidly. Japanese pilots are still brave, still skilled, still dangerous, but now skill must compensate for fragility. And fragility is an unforgiving burden. The myth of invincibility has cracked. The only question left is how long it can hold. The myth of invincibility has cracked. Now it begins to collapse. By late 1942 and into 1943, Allied pilots no longer treat the Zero as a mystery. They treat it as a known quantity. The lessons learned over Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and countless smaller engagements are now formalized. Briefings change, training changes, even the language pilots use changes. Do not turn, use altitude, hit once and disengage, survive first. These are not suggestions, they are doctrine. The Zero's weakness, once invisible behind its elegance, is now openly discussed. Its lack of armor, its unprotected fuel tanks, its fragile structure at high speed. Allied pilots understand that they do not need sustained fire. They need one moment of contact. And American industry delivers the aircraft to exploit it. The F-4F Wildcat remains in service, but now it fights smarter. Then come newer fighters, faster, heavier, more forgiving. Aircraft that trade finesse for durability. Machines that can absorb mistakes and still bring pilots home. Against them, the Zero's strengths become liabilities. Japanese pilots find themselves in an impossible position. To exploit the Zero's maneuverability, they must slow down and commit. But slowing down makes them vulnerable to diving attacks. To avoid being hit, they must stay fast, but speed robs them of control. There is no perfect solution. Veteran Japanese pilots adapt as best they can. They fly more cautiously. They avoid unnecessary engagements. They protect inexperienced wingmen. But every engagement now favors the side that can afford losses, and Japan cannot. Attrition begins to tell. Experienced Japanese pilots are lost faster than they can be replaced. Training hours shrink. New pilots arrive with less confidence, fewer instincts, and no margin for error. The Zero, once an extension of the pilot, now demands perfection from men who cannot yet provide it. Allied pilots feel the difference immediately. Engagements become shorter, Zeros break off sooner, attacks lose coordination. The air war becomes less about individual brilliance and more about systems radar, formations, logistics, replacement. This is the true exposure of the Zero's weakness. Not that it is a bad aircraft, but that it is an aircraft built for a kind of war that no longer exists. By 1943, Japanese fighters no longer dominate the sky. They contest it briefly, dangerously, and at great cost. Every mistake is fatal. Every hit is final. And when an aircraft demands perfection to survive, it becomes a liability in a long war. The Zero had ruled the sky when skill alone decided battles. But wars are not won by perfection. They are won by endurance. Wars are not won by perfection. They are won by endurance. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific is no longer a contest of ideas. It is a test of which side can survive longer. The Zero still flies. It still turns beautifully. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it can still kill, but experience is becoming rare and beauty no longer matters. The skies are now filled with Allied aircraft built around a single assumption. Pilots will be hit and must live through it. Hellcats arrive in overwhelming numbers. Corsairs follow. Aircraft that climb faster, dive harder, and absorb punishment the Zero was never meant to withstand. American pilots make mistakes and come home. Japanese pilots make mistakes and do not. That difference compounds. Radar now detects Japanese aircraft long before they arrive. Intercepts are coordinated. Altitude is controlled. Zeros are forced to fight on terms chosen by the enemy, at speeds and angles that expose every weakness Allied pilots have learned to exploit. By this stage, the Zero's hidden flaw is no longer hidden at all. It cannot forgive. It cannot absorb damage. It cannot survive brief contact. It cannot protect the pilot inside it. Japanese pilots feel this with every mission. They fly, knowing that even a perfect maneuver may not save them, that a single hit, sometimes even a near miss, can end everything. Confidence drains away, replaced by caution, then resignation. Some pilots adapt by avoiding combat whenever possible. Others are ordered into missions where survival is no longer expected. The Zero, once a symbol of mastery, becomes a vessel for sacrifice. For Allied pilots, the realization comes quietly. They are no longer fighting an equal. They are fighting an opponent trapped by earlier success, an aircraft designed for brilliance in a short war, now broken by the demands of a long one. The Zero did not suddenly fail. The war simply changed around it. And the Allies changed faster. By 1945, Japanese fighters no longer control the sky. They pass through it briefly, under constant threat, before being forced away or destroyed. Air superiority has shifted so completely that tactics scarcely matter anymore. The Zero ruled when skill and elegance decided battles. It fell when survivability, numbers, and systems took over. That was its hidden weakness. Not in its wings, not in its engine, but in the assumption that perfection could last forever. When Allied pilots exposed that truth, the sky changed hands and never returned.